Hello and welcome. We're about to take a global tour of 6 potential flashpoints that could really define the year 2026. We're going to break down the key tensions, who the major players are, and what's actually at stake in each of these critical spots around the world. Okay, let's dive right in. The analysis we're looking at starts with this incredibly sobering assessment. And what it's telling us is that we're not just looking at a few random events, but a really disturbing global trend. It's a world where conflict is actually on the rise, and the established rules of war, well, they're increasingly being ignored. This really sets a grim stage for everything we're about to cover. So, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big picture, the view from 30,000 feet. Then, we'll zoom in on specific hotspots in Southeast Asia, the Americas, Europe, Africa, and we'll finish up in East Asia. So, first up is this overarching theme. The argument here is that these aren't just isolated incidents. We're seeing a worrying global pattern of rising conflict, and it's a pattern that's becoming even more lethal and complex thanks to new technologies like drone warfare and military AI. All right, our first stop takes us to Southeast Asia. There's a long simmering border dispute between Thailand and Cambodia that has recently just flared up again, and this time it's turned deadly. It really threatens to destabilize the whole region as we head into 2026. And just look at how this thing escalated. This wasn't some sudden explosion of violence. It started small, with a single death back in May. Then it grew to a multi-day clash in July that needed mediators to step in. And by December, it had blown up into a major outbreak that killed 23 people and forced 500,000 civilians to run for their lives. And you have to understand, this isn't just a military issue. Domestic politics is absolutely pouring fuel on the fire. A leaked phone call. It involved a former Thai prime minister. It created this huge scandal that just massively inflamed anti-Cambodian feelings, which of course makes finding a peaceful resolution that much harder. Next up, let's head over to the Americas. Tensions are seriously spiking in the Caribbean, where a really significant U.S. military deployment near Venezuela has raised the risk of a direct and, frankly, potentially explosive confrontation. 15,000. Let that sink in for a second. That's the number of U.S. troops, and they're backed by a dozen warships. We're talking aircraft carriers and destroyers that have been moved into the southern Caribbean. It's an absolutely massive show of force. And here's where it gets really tricky, because there are two completely different stories being told. Officially, the U.S. says this deployment is all about fighting drug trafficking. But Venezuela? They allege the real reason is a plan to seize its oil reserves, which happen to be the largest on the entire planet. And then you have this quote from the U.S. president, which adds a really chilling layer to the whole situation. It's a direct hint that this buildup could escalate from just ships at sea to an actual ground conflict. And that could turn this tense standoff into a full-blown hot war. Now let's jump over to Europe, where the threat looks very, very different. The analysis here is focused on Russia's strategy of so-called hybrid war. Basically, it's a campaign of sabotage, intimidation, and subversion that's all designed to destabilize its neighbors without actually triggering a full-scale war with NATO. And you can see the escalating pattern right here. It starts with repeated airspace violations in September. Then in November, there's a spy ship suspected of mapping critical undersea internet cables. And then comes a major ramp-up of drone attacks on Ukraine. Russia is clearly testing boundaries and probing for weaknesses all across the continent. This warning from NATO's chief, wow, it signals a profound shift. European leaders aren't just talking about deterrence anymore. They're actually starting to prepare their own people for the possibility of a major war on a scale that we haven't seen in generations. Okay, over to Africa, where the analysis points to two distinct but equally devastating crises. First, there's a jihadist insurgency that's spreading from the Sahel region out to the coastal nations. And second, there's the absolutely brutal and complex civil war happening in Sudan. The spread of violence in West Africa is just stark. This insurgency, it isn't contained. It's pushing south. And as a result, countries like Benin saw fatalities from these militant attacks jump by 70% in just 1 year. That's a massive spike. Now let's turn to Sudan. As its civil war moves into a third year, the human toll is it's staggering. More than 150,000 people have been killed. And beyond that incredible death toll, the conflict has created a humanitarian catastrophe. 12 million people have been internally displaced, forced from their homes by the violence. It's created one of the worst displacement crises in the world today. And this is really important to understand. This is not just an internal struggle. You have the two main factions, the official Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary RSF. But critically, you have international powers like Egypt, Turkey, and the UAE all backing different sides, which is turning a civil war into a much larger regional proxy conflict. For our final stop, we head to what is arguably the world's most dangerous flashpoint, the strait between China and Taiwan. The question here isn't really if tensions will rise, but how, and more importantly, when they might finally boil over. So China's military has reportedly been ordered to be ready for an invasion by 2027. This has left all the analysts debating the central strategic question. If Beijing decides to make a move, what does it look like? Is it a full-scale, all-out invasion, or is it a less direct but still crippling naval blockade? And this really highlights the immense dilemma that Beijing is facing. A full invasion would be one of the most difficult military operations in history. But a blockade, while maybe less risky on the military side, would almost certainly trigger severe international sanctions that could absolutely devastate China's economy. Now, as we pull back for a final global view, it's so important to remember that these 6 areas we've talked about, they aren't the only ones. The analysis also notes major tensions in the Middle East, Central Africa, and South Asia. It paints a picture of truly widespread instability. This statement from the ICRC, it's just so powerful, and it really captures the core takeaway here. These are not just isolated events. They're all symptoms of a larger global pattern, where armed conflict has become a tragically defining feature of our time. So, what's the key takeaway from all this? Well, it's that these conflicts are not happening in a vacuum. They are all interconnected, and they're often fueled by wider geopolitical rivalries. The ultimate question, really, as we watch these events unfold in 2026 is, in a world this tangled up, where and how does anyone even begin to reverse this dangerous trend?